The following episode contains references to terrorism, violence, and deaths. Listener discretion is advised.
हिट करो लगाओ फायर साले को खोल दो चैम्बर खोल दो लगाओ
मतलब ना आपने हर तरीके से जो गिरफ्तारी का जो चांस है ना इसको नहीं मतलब सामने आने देना, ये अवॉइड करना है। वालेकुम अस्सलाम। हाँ जी, मुझे फायर लगा गया कहाँ लगा कहाँ लगा
बाबू पे लगा है, पाँव पे लगा है। कवर लो उमर कवर लो।
Only 3 days ago, it was the 16th anniversary of the horrific Mumbai terror attacks. A terror attack that brought the city that never sleeps to a grinding halt for 60 harrowing hours. A time when 10 Lashkar-e-Taiba terrorists wreaked havoc across the financial capital of Mumbai. 2 of the city's biggest hotels, a historic train station, a hugely popular cafe, a Jewish synagogue, a hospital, and a cinema. They were all attacked. At least 166 people, including 20 security force personnel and 26 foreigners, were killed and more than 300 injured in the attacks that took place in 2008. While the trauma and deep damage caused by such attacks is unquantifiable, there's an absolute tangible cost to them. So earlier this year, the Global Terrorism Index said that the total deaths from terrorism increased by 22% to 8,352 in 2023, now at their highest since 2017. Even excluding the October 7th Israel attacks, deaths would still have increased by 5%. This is, by the way, despite terrorist incidents decreasing by 22% to 3,350, resulting in a 56% increase in the average number of people killed per attack. And you should know, this is the worst rate in almost 10 years. So what is the real cost of terrorism? How do these organizations operate? Where do they get their funds from? How much of a role does Bitcoin play? Could we inadvertently be funding a terrorist organization without even knowing it? What are some of the most dangerous terrorist outfits in India today? And how are they likely to play out in 2025? Tune in as we decode all of this and more with a top counterterrorism policy analyst and an ace researcher who's worked on the Global Terrorism Index as they delve deep into all that we need to know about the business of terror. It's Friday, November 29th. I'm your host, Diya Rekhi, and you are listening to The Economics of Terrorism only on the Morning Brief from The Economic Times. The economic cost of a terror attack is obviously the damages a nation incurs after such an attack. It consists of the following: restoring damaged structures, lost income earnings of those who lost their lives, expenditure on the care of those injured and suffering traumas due to lost family members, increased expenditure on anti-terrorist measures, and security precautions at places like airports, trains and bus stations, international cricket games, and large events. It can also lead to a nation losing face on the global stage, a drop in tourist activity, and foreign investments pulling out as a result. Some estimates say that in 2019, the total cost from terrorism amounted to $26.4 billion. And just so you know, the highest economic costs were registered in 2014 at $115.8 billion. And just for context, the September 11th attacks had one of the highest ever economic impacts of any single incident at $40.6 billion. Let's first look at the problem in terms of sheer volumes. As I said, the numbers are growing, and not just because of instances of terrorism that we're all aware of. There are several alarming offshoots that are bringing the threats of terrorism closer to you and me than we ever imagined. I spoke to Thomas Morgan, who is the Chief Research Officer at the Institute for Economics and Peace, or the IEP, in Australia. The IEP publishes the Global Terrorism Index, which I've been citing from extensively, and which is also the most comprehensive resource for global terrorism. Thank you so much, Thomas, for joining us on the Morning Brief. It's an absolute pleasure to have you. I just wanted to start off by getting you to give our listeners some of the most striking findings that you came across when you put out the Global Terrorism Index earlier this year.
So I think there are three key findings from the 2024 Global Terrorism Index. The first is that the number of deaths from terrorism increased in 2023, which was the first time we'd seen an increase for a number of years. So the total number of people killed in terrorist attacks increased to over 8,000, which was a 22% increase on the previous year. I think there are two main reasons for that rise. There has been an increase in the average number of deaths per incident. So it rose from 1.6 deaths per attack in 2022 to 2.5 in 2023. The attack in Israel, there were so many people killed in a single attack, so an estimated 1,200 people killed in that one single attack. That had a significant impact on the average number of deaths. Then again, we see again that the sort of epicenter of terrorism is in the Sahel region in sub-Saharan Africa. So we have most of the countries with the highest impact of terrorism are now in sub-Saharan Africa. And in fact, on the report this year, it was the first time that we had a country other than Afghanistan or Iraq have the worst impact of terrorism on the index. So looking at Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali, those are areas with high levels of political instability. You have a lack of state capacity and state control, particularly in the tri-border region. And so that's a region where you've seen just a huge increase in the level of violence over the past decade. So looking at from 2010 onwards. And there's been no sign of that slowing down in 2024. So it's very likely that Burkina Faso will once again be the country that's most impacted by terrorism. Increases also in Mali and Niger. So by far, the large majority of terrorism occurs in conflict situations. So you're seeing an increasing sophistication of terrorist attacks in conflict zones by highly organized and competent militant groups. So fewer smaller attacks, fewer attacks in the West, but a high number of attacks, with the largest rise occurring in sub-Saharan Africa. And then the third most striking finding, I think, was the October 7th attacks in Israel. And that was the largest terrorism attack since September 11th. So I think those are the three key findings from the report this year.
In all that you've studied so far, which are the most dangerous terrorist organizations that operate today, and what is the trend that worries you the most?
So if we look at some of the most prominent groups in the world today, so if you look at an organization like JNIM, which is very active in the central Sahel region, it's an armed militant group, not solely a terrorist group, but it often uses terrorism as a tactic. In terms of the two groups that I think are the most dangerous and we're likely to see the biggest threat in the future, the first, of course, is Islamic State, but in particular ISK, so Islamic State Khorasan chapter. That's a group that up until last year was primarily focused at its activities in Afghanistan. However, this year it carried out attacks in Russia, it carried out attacks in Iran, and had several foiled plots in Europe as well. The other area where, of course, there's always a strong threat is from unaffiliated, somewhat random terrorist attacks. So that's the predominant form of terrorism, and is sometimes referred to as stochastic terrorism. So one of the things that we've seen there is that you have a highly or potentially volatile situation, but that it's not, for the most part, carried out by organized armed extremist groups. So the groups that are organized tend to be easier to track, easier to infiltrate for intelligence and security services. The real concern is from mass atrocity attacks, lone wolf attacks, where you have people who become radicalized very quickly over a very short period of time. And the methods that are employed can be highly opportunistic. So if you think of the spate of terrorism in the 2010s in Europe, you have a lot of attacks using cars and trucks and other vehicles and so on. So if you look at something like the Christchurch attacks in New Zealand, there was very little focus on right-wing extremism in New Zealand, and all of a sudden you have one of the most horrendous terrorist attacks of the last decade.
Also, Thomas, when you say terrorism, right, there are different definitions for it, but we've seen that there have been so many armed conflicts, so many prolonged wars that have been taking place, and there could be acts of terror that take place in such instances as well. So where do you really make that distinction between what is a terror attack and what is not?
It's a very good question. And certainly in times of conflict, that's when you sort of have the biggest issue with the definition of terrorism and applying that consistently. So there's a four-part definition of terrorism. One, that it has to be intentional or deliberate act of violence. Secondly, that it has to be carried out by a non-state group for a political or religious or ideological separatist purpose. So that excludes activity by organized criminal organizations. And then the final criterion is that it has to be aiming to instill a sense of fear or coerce a larger audience beyond the immediate victims. So as long as those four criteria are met, even if the act occurs in the context of a conflict, it'll still be counted as terrorism. We do go to quite some efforts to make sure that we're not double counting between conflict and terrorism, but that is the area where it's most difficult to adjudicate whether an act is solely an act of terrorism or a legitimate act of violence that's taking place in a conflict.
Right. And what are some of the current conflicts that you feel can spark really big terror incidents next year? Or do you feel the nature of terrorism in itself is that it is unpredictable and it will hit us out of the blue?
That's a very good question. I mean, in terms of the conflicts that are currently active in the world, and you're looking at the largest conflicts occurring in Gaza and now in Lebanon to a certain extent, and in Ukraine, don't necessarily expect to see an immediate uptick in terrorist activity in those regions. I mean, I think there are some concerns that those wars would potentially instigate and inspire terrorist activity in other regions. There was certainly concern at the start of the war in Gaza that would lead to increased terrorist activity in Europe, for example. That hasn't seemed to eventuate. But I think your second point is key, which is that whenever we're talking about predictions and where terrorism might occur, often it occurs in a way that's very surprising. So without necessarily saying that it's definitely going to occur next year, if you look at attacks in Christchurch or the Easter attacks in Sri Lanka, these were areas traditionally where you didn't have high levels of terrorism, where you have these attacks which were not totally unexpected, but were, in a certain sense, came out of the blue. So I think that's always the danger with terrorism, that a new hotspot can emerge where you're not expecting terrorist activity at all.
And Thomas, coming to India, right? I know that this is a global terrorism index that you work on, but what are some India-specific trends or observations that you have made over the years with the Global Terrorism Index that you can share with our listeners? Something that you saw maybe in 2024, something you've seen over the years, or something that you expect going forward in 2025?
So India's consistently had a higher level of terrorism than most countries in the world, but having said that, the level is a lot lower than terrorist hotspots like the Central Sahel or in the Middle East in the past 2 decades. So there's a very consistent but low level of terrorism in India since we have data, so going back to 2007. Having said that, the total level of terrorism has been declining in India for the past 15 years. So if you look in terms of the total number of people killed, I think it's more than halved in the past 15 years. I mean, and the thing about India, of course, very large country, shares borders with many other countries. So as a result, there are a number of political and ethnic and territorial disputes. So as a result, you have a large number of very small-scale terrorist organizations. So if you look since 2007, there have been 90 different organizations which have been responsible for at least one terrorist attack in India. The majority of those only commit 1 or 2 attacks, and then they disband or merge with other groups. So most of the terrorism in India is of that low level.
Be that as it may, India is spending thousands of crores on counterterrorism measures, both within the country and outside it. For instance, in May this year, it contributed $500,000 to the UN Counterterrorism Trust Fund to help strengthen poorer member states in Eastern and Southern Africa. With this contribution, India's cumulative financial support to the trust fund now stands at $2.55 million. Interestingly, in comparison to combating terrorist forces, fostering them is really cheap. In fact, funding terror activities is a very economical way of inflicting lasting damage on a nation, says my next guest, Dr. Abhinav Pandya. Dr. Pandya specializes in counterterrorism, Indian foreign policy, and Afghanistan Pakistan geopolitics.
A country indulges in supporting a proxy terrorist group, or let's say groups, only because it realizes that it is not able to defeat the adversary in a proper conventional war, which requires huge expenditure on your large infantry battalions, artillery units, rocket forces, etc., etc. Supporting a terror machinery costs much less than indulging in a proper war. I'll just give you an example. So, Pakistan sends around 250 to 300 militants every year in Kashmir. Now, to counter those number of militants, this small number of terrorists who are coming from Pakistan, India maintains a force of 3,43,000. Now, some estimates even suggest that we are maintaining 6 to 7 lakhs. Now, imagine the amount which we are spending on maintaining this huge number of security forces in Jammu and Kashmir. Giving you some more figures, cultivating a terrorist, right from recruiting and sending him to India, it costs around 2 lakhs, which includes giving some money to him when the person joins militancy, and secondly giving him a weapon which is mostly AK-47. Now AK-47, which is a Chinese made, it costs around 60,000, and the one which is made in Darra Khel, Pakistan, costs around 27,000 to 30,000. So in total the expenditure comes to 2 lakhs. Now, if that one militant, when he comes to Kashmir, if he is hiding somewhere, security forces get an input about his presence in some places, then they'll start CASO operations based on intelligence inputs. Every day almost you have about 50 to 60 CASO operations, which also includes unsuccessful operations. Each CASO includes your army, police and paramilitary forces, about 8 to 10 lakhs of expenditure. Between 2000 to 2016, Jammu and Kashmir got 10% of India's development grant. Now it has the population of 1%. I mean, its population is just 1% of India's total population. Even in the 11 special category states, it got disproportionately high amount of funds, that is 1.14 lakh crores. So I think it costs us in many ways. Yeah.
Those are some really stark comparative figures, Abhinav. If you can now break down terror financing for my listener a little bit more, what really goes into funding a well-oiled terror machinery?
So let me give you a brief philosophical background first. Orchestrating a terror attack does not cost you much. Back in the 1990s, they were able to execute a grenade blast by paying merely 25 rupees to an urchin. Even 9/11, this whole thing didn't cost much, around 60 lakhs or something. But if you want to sustain terrorism or militancy in a conflict zone over a long period of time, then you need to invest in multiple areas. We can have one case study of Jammu and Kashmir here. So Pakistan realized that the population there was relatively liberal. They followed the Sufi moderate form of indigenous Islam. So they thought that no, you need to invest in radicalizing this population so that you can sustain militancy for a long period of time. Secondly, they created this economics of terror. I mean, they created this terror financing such a lucrative business opportunity that even common people started benefiting from that. In that, they started making investments. Now, first, there are two things. First is the raising money for terrorism, and secondly, movement of money. Sources for raising money includes jihad donations from Gulf, US, Europe, and fake currency, extortion of traders and contractors in J&K. In many other countries, also this extortion is a common phenomenon. Money sent by ISI via Hawala to the separatist leaders. There are multiple separatist organizations. Some the smaller organizations get around 5 lakh per month. The larger organizations used to get 20 lakh per month. Then you have taxes like zakat, usr. Then you have other innovative sources like raising terror funds through Hajj tours and travels, through MBBS seats, through the LOC trade and legitimate businesses like carpet business, through handloom and handicraft industry. Now ISIS indulged in organ trading, smuggling cigarettes, little gold. These African terror groups, they were indulging in all that. No, they were also raising terror funds by smuggling and selling little watches, gadgets. There can be multiple ways. Imagine a situation where you have let's say a lot of Rohingyas settled in some part of India and they get fake papers, and through that Jandhan scheme, if each account is deposited with 10,000, 15,000, it's a very small amount. And if they are collected at a later stage by some coordinator, and if it gets into terror business, how do we find that out? So it's very challenging. So these things are becoming very common, particularly the online fraud. And crowdfunding has also emerged as a major source of generating money for terror business. Hamas has been using that money, and there are multiple ways. Then you have the second head of movement of terror funds, and that mostly takes place through hawala.
Right. And what is the kind of role that Bitcoin and digital currency are playing when it comes to terror financing today?
Bitcoins and digital currency have emerged as the new payment methods and new, ways of generating and moving terror money. And it's very convenient because there is complete anonymity. You cannot, trace the sources and final destination of, the terror funds. So it's very easy. It is already happening with the bigger terror groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda, the transnational terror groups. But it has lately, even in places like Jammu and Kashmir, they have started using Bitcoins as terror funding methods. Particularly after the abrogation of Article 370, NIA has launched a major crackdown on terror funding ecosystem. So now they are trying to find new methods of raising terror funds and moving terror funds.
The government claims to have made giant strides in combating terrorism. Why do you think India is still vulnerable?
I would say, there's several concerns, and, they're all very complementary to each other. First and foremost, we are very vulnerable because, see, our borders are quite porous, as we can see that in Jammu and Kashmir, even after all the concertina, wire fencing and everything, the borders continue to remain porous. And there has been massive infiltration of terrorists from the Kashmir region, from Jammu region, from this Doda Kathua region, so from the Punjab region also, now we can expect some more infiltration. Bangladesh, Nepal border, they are also likely to be more sensitive, particularly after the ouster of the Hasina regime. And besides that, I feel that our state intelligence machinery is in a very bad shape. And leave aside Jammu and Kashmir, but in rest of the India, in the other states of India, the police systems, particularly in the states, they're not, efficient enough to counter these challenges. Their training levels, their intelligence network is in a very bad shape. Thirdly, now lately in India, in response to some of the steps taken by government, like the discussion of the Waqf Board Amendment Act and the CA NRC, there I can see that there is a strong consolidation among the Muslims. Now these measures, they're not strictly anti-Muslim, but there's a major segment among the Muslim community which perceive them as anti-Muslim, and some of the radical clerics and extremists, they try to play a major role abetting the large segment of population against the government.
The Financial Action Task Force, or the FATF, which is a global money laundering and terrorist financing watchdog, in September had said that India is largely compliant in dealing with terrorism. It said India has put in place an effective system to tackle terror financing and money laundering, which is very often the means to finance terror. But there are gaps too, mainly rambling trials and inadequate risk assessment of financial crimes. For instance, over the past 5 years, the Directorate of Enforcement, India's key agency for combating money laundering, has seen only 28 convictions, which is obviously just a fraction of the actual instances of money laundering happening in the country. There are other gaps too, like outdated practices to combat the abuse of non-profit organizations for terror financing. And there are, of course, constantly evolving challenges. Social media has allowed both international and domestic terrorists to gain unprecedented virtual access to people living in countries far, far away. ISIS, for instance, encourages sympathizers to carry out simple attacks wherever they're located, or to travel to ISIS-held territory in Iraq and Syria and join its ranks as foreign fighters. And this message has resonated with supporters not just in India, but across the globe. It's frightening and it's concerning just how persuasive and pervasive such messaging can be. But as citizens, the best we can do is try and be more aware and report any suspicious activity to the authorities. Before I let you go, I'd request you to join me for a minute's silence in memory of all those who lost their lives in the 26/11 terror attack. May we never witness anything as horrific ever again. Thank you, Abhinav and Thomas. It's Friday, November 29th. I'm your host, Diya Rekhi, and you were listening to The Economics of Terrorism only on the Morning Brief from The Economic Times. This episode was produced by Surohini Jain and sound designed by Rajas Nayak. Do share and subscribe if you enjoyed the episode. The Morning Brief drops every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday on a listening platform of your choice. Thank you and have a good weekend. All clips used in this episode belong to their respective owners. Credits are mentioned in the description.